Where's the So good morning, everybody. I'm Billy Williamson with Department of Transportation and Development. I'm one of the leads on the LWI statewide data and modeling tag and the modeling program. So we're just kind of here today to provide an update on where we are with the modeling effort and kind of give you some details on specifically how we're building the models. So I'll start us off with a general kind of modeling program update. I'm going to try to speed through those because I am the least intelligent person up here, and that's who you want to hear from. Then we'll get some slides from HDR, just kind of giving the basics of modeling, and then specifically where Region 5 is. Some of our friends with Henry are going to give us a little talk about kind of the model use cases. And then Brett McMahon with the Water Institute will kind of discuss the MUSM development and access, some compound flooding case studies, future work that we're looking at doing. And then finally, some of the work we're looking into with consequence modeling in the coming stages. So this is just to kind of gain a high level understanding of the program, how these models can be used statewide by the state, some of the regional uses of these models at the, the Region 5 level. And then finally, just really understand the scale of the model that we're producing. That kind of tells you how and what it can do. But that's just what we are modeling now. And that's one of the things we want to focus on is this is baseline modeling that we're providing. Okay, so what we're not doing right now, the goal is to build calibrated and validated historic models to evaluate projects, plans, any sort of mitigation updates within the region. We want to keep these alive, though. We want to sustain these. These models are going to be our baby as the LWI. And so we want to have them live a long and healthy life and keep them alive, keep them updated and maintained into the future. So right now, whenever we're talking about this modeling and kind of watershed approach, we have to understand that we are taking on an effort that is a scale that we just haven't seen in the country or really the world to this time. And so we have a fantastic group of modelers, consultants, surveyors in all the different regions that are working on this. And so there's a lot of pride going into this program that we really are leading the charge on this. Okay, and one of the things I did want to focus on here is that these models can be used to evaluate the entire watershed. Once you do that, you can kind of see how these projects are affecting the entire watershed, then you know who you need to collaborate with. That's one of the things that's important to look at that for future. All this federal funding, state funding that's coming out, it has requirements that you show no adverse impacts. That's been a very, very flexible term in the past. With these models and the way that FEMA is going, the way that HUD is going, that flexibility is going away. And so these models can be used to show the extent of benefits in any adverse conditions, so you can prove that your project does more good than bad within your area and does not impact anybody outside negatively. So at DOTD, we're contracting 7 different regions. You're in Region 5 on the modeling. As you know, we now have, I think, 9 watershed coalitions. So it's a little bit different than our map is the coalition map. We're doing all the modeling on a Huc-8 scale. The only difference there is in Region 4. If you see there's a red part that kind of jogs into Texas there, that's basically a small part of the Toledo Bend Huc-8. And so they're just basically putting that together with the Louisiana Huc-8. Most of it's just getting water flows into the state. So we're not even really modeling most of that. But that's the only one that's really not staying at the Huc-8 scale. We're using HEC HMS and HEC-RAS, some models that are being built are using only HEC-RAS. HEC-HMS is your hydrology software, says where the water is going to, which streams it's getting to, kind of your timing of it. And then you're modeling your hydraulics, your HEC-RAS is getting into the defined channels, kind of. Some of the newer 2D, they're using rain on grid where they do that HMS portion within HEC-RAS. One of the reasons why we chose these suites of software is that they are developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so they are free to use by all consulting firms, all engineers in the state. And we thought that was important because we want these models to be able to be used by all of our different firms around the state for all their different project evaluations and project developments. So the design approaches and all the models were reviewed and approved by the TDQ based on the guidance on modeling methodology. And that is just a document that's saying we recognize that there are differences in these different watersheds, but it's basically giving you consistency in how the models are built, knowing that they're not all going to be the same, but they can be consistent in their approach. So we're using a wide variety of data sets here. The two that we're going to kind of touch on the most, I think, well, the one later is the structural inventory that the Water Institute is helping kind of spearhead for this effort. That one's going to be very important coming in the future. But the other one is we got some updated LiDAR, and it's something that we will continue to update. And that's something that we see as we move this into the future, that there's going to be future LiDAR updates coming. And Region 5 was actually one of the bigger issues we discovered there that kind of took some, I guess, flexibility on HDR's team to come to a resolution on that one. But we were able to move forward on that. But these can be used, like, again, I'm going to harp on baseline. As you see, the second bullet says outputs from these models can be used on their own or combined to create new special purpose tools. And so whenever you look at these, aren't going to be great for developing your street drainage system. However, these can give you very, very vital information for tailwater conditions that could be affecting that system and the timing of those and how it affects. So then you can look at, hey, we're increasing a discharge here. We're designing to the 25. Well, let's put it into our watershed and make sure it's not all peaking at the same time and causing us more problems. So this is not where these models end. What we're turning over is where these models begin. I mean, it's going to be good models for evaluating watershed scale projects, but there's so much more that can be built onto this. And we want that to really make sure that that doesn't get lost in the conversation. So this is kind of some of the program data and products. I'm just going to leave it there for a moment. We mentioned the design approaches, all the HUC-8s. We're identifying all the kind of different structures that are out there, the levee database, the dams throughout the state, the structural inventory at DOTD. We're looking at getting an inventory of all of our hydraulic structures through the state, which is a massive number and a massive undertaking. But it's kind of the idea that we have to get all this data together to understand where our risk is so that we can basically go start attacking it with the little amount of money that we're having to fight over to make sure that we spend the funding in the best way possible where it's most needed. So this top bullet point is what I'm going to focus on here. The outputs of these models are nearly important as the models themselves. Whenever you start looking at that, you have flow velocity rasters. You can come out with depth rasters where it shows not just depth and velocity in different locations. So whenever you're looking at your flood risk to certain events, you know, depth velocities of certain events, you kind of have an idea of you might have some loss of life there. So we need to focus on deploying assets to that specific location to ensure that people aren't putting themselves at risk. And so as we continue growing this, as we mentioned those previous data sets that we're collecting, LWI, we're trying to keep it alive into the future and keep all this collaboration going so that all these data sets can be brought together and kept in a single point so that we can collaborate between those and everybody knows what everybody else has. So right now, as we mentioned, we're building the regional HUC-8 models using hydrologic and hydraulic, sometimes together, sometimes separately. They will be producing a modeling report at the end and a modeling quick guide. That's basically when an engineer were to download that model, they can look at the quick guide and kind of see why certain decisions were made, why was a certain friction coefficient chosen for a certain area. And so it just kind of gives them an idea of why it was built that way so they can understand what changes they're making and how it could affect the model. Some of the outputs we're looking at, as we mentioned, depth grids, velocity grids, water surface elevations. Now, right now, we're building these on historic storms. We're calibrating and validating to historic storms. And so you get through calibration, you take your first set of storms, you go and you tweak them, and you say, okay, now we've got this model, we've turned the knobs where it's following these 5 storms pretty closely. So we're done tweaking. Now we take 2 other events that we have not calibrated to, and we run it through those. And we check that we're pretty close to those, which then validates that our calibration was correct. But it's important to realize that it's historic. We're not to those design storms yet, which is kind of the next process, as we mentioned, down in outputs. Then we have a couple of future outputs. Now we want to be very careful whenever we say historic and AEP flood boundaries, because that's going to be very dependent on how far we go with design storms. So to get accurate flood boundaries and flows, you have to do more storms. You have to get a little bit more aggressive with how you design it. Whether we do that now or as a future effort statewide, that's still to be decided, but it's something we recognize would be very, very valuable to potentially get more accurate risk maps than what's out there now. And then, as I mentioned, Brett will talk about a bit, we also were looking at those compound flooding events in coastal areas. I won't touch on the tools and future applications. I could go on all day, and I want to get it turned over to our folks at HDR. So finally, as I mentioned, Brett and his team are working with Purdue, I believe, to put together the new statewide structure inventory. The current data set that is used is the NSI data, National Structural Inventory. It's been pretty outdated. When we ran the AMET pilot model, one of the things that they found on their consequence modeling was that they had to do a lot more work than they expected getting the structures where they are and how high they are. So they would be mislocated on the inventory. And so it gives you a false sense of risk if you don't know where the houses actually are or where those businesses are. And so that's kind of what they're working on, is getting that inventory list accurate so that whenever we do the consequence modeling, it's throwing it over an accurate inventory of structures. Okay, so that base model, as we talked about, is calibrated and validated historic storms. We're currently heavily into that process. We're still aiming for the end of this year for calibrated and validated events statewide or models, with some of those tie-in documents in the end might be a little bit behind, but we can at least start using the models at a high level at that point to evaluate different things. We'll then add in those different design storms that we're talking about. The final decisions on exactly how those will be built is still under discussion, but we expect that to be tasked out by the end of the year, probably hopefully before the fall. Finally, Brett will talk about the transition zone, some of the pilots they did on that, and finally, potential mapping of modeling outputs. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Garland and Eric from HDR, and they'll get you some of the real details of the modeling.
Okay, so you can stand the mic. Move it out your way so you get out of there. Good, very good. Sure. Yeah. So I'm Garland Tennyson. I'm the project manager. You've seen my face before. Eric Skinina is with me. Eric is our technical modeling lead. Eric is a member of the Louisiana Floodplain Management Managers Association, LFMA, here in the state, and also was involved with developing the original MEAT model. The outcome that I'd like for you to have at the end of the presentation is we're really completed or in the process of completing our setup models and moving into the calibration phase. But what I hope that you have a sense at the end of the presentation is how these models were created, how complex they are, but also my real desire is that the one thing I think that Region 5 has has really projected across the state is this collaboration. Kia and I presented at LFMA on the regional collaboration and how important it is to us to have that regional aspect. Because in my 43 years of practice in central and south central Louisiana, I think it is so important. I work across the United States. I see what's happening. I'm also a coastal engineer, and the changing climates, the changing risk profiles necessitates that we do this. I'm so proud of the state of Louisiana for being an innovator in this regard and saying, you know what, if we're going to do surgery, we have to have the tools to do the surgery. We're just not going to go in there and do exploratory surgery to fix a little valve that we can fix, or we're not going to make that decision to do this that then has this adverse impact on another organ, right? This is what these tools provide. This is 10,000 square miles plus in Region 5. We're talking Chaffalay, Tesh, Vermilion, Mermentau. That's basically everything from the time you leave Lake Charles to when you almost get to Baton Rouge, from the Gulf of Mexico, Morgan City, where I was born, to Alexandria, where I did a lot of my practice for Matt's from. So I hope you get a sense of how complex these models are. And I also hope you get the sense that these frameworks that we're creating are not the ending. Like Billy said, you know, the goal is to do no harm. I would say, Billy, I'd add to that, and it's also the goal is to do good too. That not only not to create an adverse impact by me walling up my property, but that whatever I do has a positive impact on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of those decisions and where these models go, I know Dr. Habib's online and, you know, has been involved in these discussions and development at UL, but where these models go in terms of water quality impact. I mean, Scooter runs Rockefeller Refuge. I mean, and is the drainage district in that area. I mean, you can do so much with these tools. Jessica's got all of, you know, Lafayette Parish in her domain. And so let's just keep that in mind. Modeling 101, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but, you know, in talking, I know that not everybody that's here or everybody that's online has a full understanding. These are the HUC boundaries. The more numbers you've got, the smaller the sub-watershed. Obviously, these are typically defined by very strong ridge lines, et cetera, or levees. When you get into Region 5 and you get into near the coastal transition zones, these boundaries disappear. They, depending on the event, water can go this way or it can go that way. This gives you a sense of scale of the HUC 8 size of unit relative to the HUC 2. And I want to thank Sarah McEwen, formerly with AECOM, that put these slides together. She did an outstanding job, and wish her the best in her new job. So HUC 8 means the watershed delineated by the USGS in terms of what constitutes how much water is coming into that. The one thing I want you to take away from this slide is as we are creating these models, the models get very large. There is this desire to be able to plug and play, right? To be able to take a smaller watershed. And the challenge is going to be path forward. How do you do that and establish, particularly when you can have flow from one to the other? Let me just say at a very high level, Brad will get into a little bit of it, but it can be done, but generally where it devolves into is really into statistical analysis, running multiple scenarios for smaller watersheds and saying, based on all these, and it's what we do in the coastal models, running these multiple scenarios, then all of a sudden I can begin to say statistically, you know, 80% of the time, this is what I can expect in terms of flow and stage. So the plug and plays can be done, but before you begin to do the plug and play models, you have to develop the whole model. So the model, what constitutes a model? It basically is the hydrologic component. It is what's coming down, where's the water sources? Is it precipitation? Is it storm surge, etc.? How much of the water is going in the ground? How much is running off? So you can't separate the hydrologic from the hydraulic components. Eric will go into a little bit more detail of coupled models. You know, there's always this desire for us to say, but that's way too complicated, simplify it. I want it simple. But then when push comes to shove, at the level of complexity we have within our systems, you can only simplify to a point, and then you're making so many gross simplifications that you're back into the region of, you almost intuitively can say, well, let's try this. Let's go build this and see who it hurts and who it helps. This modeling process, by connecting the hydrometeorological aspects of it to the hydrology aspects of it to the hydraulics, is the only way to know for a given event where that water's going, how's it flowing, and is it impacting. So there is the hydrology component. This is a typical HMS model that you see here. This is basically routing water based on the land use, the terrain, etc. The areas that Eric will focus on, he'll explain where we have fairly strong HMS, where we can develop fairly strong HMS models. Once you're into the flatter terrain, you're really into a modeling routine we call rain on grid that he'll go in more detail on. But that's where the 2D RAS 2D models work really best. The hydrology, I would say, you know, for example, like I know that one of the exercises we did, for example, in Nebraska, which is a state that is developing more and more, getting models for more and more of its regions and cataloging those. When you start to optimize detention pond sightings, for example, you know, we all know that Mr. Don's here, and you know, the Evangelin's done the NRCS has done a detention work plan years ago for the Upper Mermentau. So with the HMS models, you can basically run genetic algorithms now with AI and machine learning and optimize where, because as Dr. Habib has mentioned, it all has to do with timing. And so where is the best place to put detention ponds, et cetera? Where's going to be the greatest impact to lowering consequences and having net benefits? These HMS models are optimal for doing that type of analysis. So this is an example of some of the data. Basically, it's land use, the terrain, the soil type, and the slope. How quickly does the water run off, and what does run off, what goes in the ground, et cetera. Obviously, as Billy has mentioned, the one thing the state has recognized is none of these models are static in time. They're a snapshot in time. They're going to change. And so the Water Institute is working with the state and others in UL to basically when do these models need to be updated? How are they updated, et cetera. Hydraulics is, now that the rain is hit, where does it go? And so this is the branch of science dealing with this. This is you can see some typical screenshots of the graphical user interface from HEC RAS. HDR is proud to have Gary Bruner, who actually won the Ben Chow Award last year, who developed the model. He led the team that developed the model, was given it as a challenge when he joined HEC all those years ago. He has since retired and now is a part-time employee of HDR. And we're grateful to have him. He's an amazing gentleman. He knows the model, and as down as I'm sure Brett and interface with him. I mean, he's just as genuine as it gets, and he really understands his model. So we're using the RAS model. The model is evolving. explain to in a later part of the slides of exactly how that is evolving, but it tells us how the water flows, where it flows, etc. So this is generally the one-dimensional steady state models are what you typically see with your FEMA FIS studies. That's where you do your no rises. If you're talking about a BLE, then you're getting more into the rise 2D. And so then on the right, you see also what we have where we combine basically into 1D, 2D. There were 2Ds, the 1Ds are basically involving sections. What's a sectional conveyance? The 2Ds, now we begin to break the land into grids and meshes. And that's typically also the way coastal models are also created, and energy balances are performed in that cell. And then whatever happens in that cell affects the cell next to it. And those are the algorithms. Something that I think in my career, when I think back, I used to do this by hand, and then I wrote my own codes, and then now the codes are so super sophisticated as to be incredible. Now we're into AI. In the hydraulics input, some of the data we need survey data, we need terrain data, we need boundary conditions. And in spite of all our advancements, we still use this thing called Manning's N. Great concept. It's basically things we don't understand, black box, but the Manning's coefficient, we've never found out a better way to model how much water moves and how it moves other than to use this Manning's N or roughness coefficient. The output typically comes where we have HMS, which is basically how much precipitation, how much is actually running off, and then that creates a hydrograph. We are finding that and I want to say kudos also to Billy for stepping in, after the program was initiated, and he had a day job before, was doing an outstanding day job with the floodplain flood management program. And then he stepped into this, and he's been a supernatural person to take lead on this and has done an outstanding job. The coupling of the HMS, what we're finding is with the advancements in HEC, the Hydrologic Engineering Center in Davis, California, with their advancements, the HMS model and the RAS model, now basically we rely on both of them. And one informs the other, and then we can adjust on the RAS model, and we can adjust the HMS. And pretty soon we're looking also at observed conditions, right? And so pretty soon the models that we're creating today, remember, nature is always the perfect example. All we're trying to do is create a numerical model that can simulate on a computer what to expect if an event happens. And these are some of the typical outputs that you'll see. So I'm gonna bring up my colleague and great friend, Eric Scanina, who's going to basically walk you through, give you and trust me, this is a brief glimpse. Let me give kudos to the way we did our HUC-8s at HDR is I found and I say it's a family, it's a team. Our best 5 leads to lead each one has a HUC-8. Eric doesn't have one. He wasn't quite that good, but he was put in charge of kind of wrangling all of that. And he can tell you the conversations and the models that we are working through, this has never been done at this scale, ever. And Region 5 is one of the biggest, baddest of the lot, not taking anything away from the other guys. The collaboration, before Eric comes up, the collaboration that we're doing with the other regions, I've never seen that before in a project either. I mean, Billy hasn't. I can't do my model if I don't know what's coming in at the Old River Control Complex and the Red River, et cetera. I can't, I'm outflowing into Fenstermaker's model for the Cameron Calcasieu reach. So, and Sabine. So there is this ongoing collaboration. These models have to talk to each other. Billy's job is to make sure that when these products come in, they coalesce, they fit, And so that all of a sudden, if we think we have problems running our little models, when I think of what happens when I try to model something at a state scale, it's, they are building the supercomputers to do that. The one thing about HEC is they're also changing the coding to allow graphical processing units to be used to compete with their competitors. And all of these things are going to, runtime should, as my friend Masood says from Worley S. Parsons, should not be as big of an issue even a year down the road. With the rate of change we're seeing in high-speed computing, the model code changes, a lot of the runtime issues and stuff are gonna go away. Eric, why don't you come up and present what we've been doing?
I successfully dodged tripping on my cord there. So yeah, I really want to reiterate kind of what Garland was saying. The work with the other regions, the other 6 regions modeling, these huge watersheds has been really great. It's been a lot of commiseration at times, dealing with difficult data to work with and model troubleshooting, because we really are pushing these HMS and RAS models farther than they really have ever gone before. Just with the size of the models, and we've come into a lot of troubleshooting and solutions and things like that, which has been really fun to work on from a pure technical standpoint. So that's been an enjoyable part and a good kind of, I think, a stalwart of the program is the collaboration, not only with the consultants and the modeling teams, but also the stakeholders and everyone else involved with the program too. But onto kind of like what we're here for as far as where we're at here in Region 5. We have our schedule up here, kind of echoing what Billy stated earlier. We should have our first kind of model calibrations and validations coming in early June here for our Atchafalaya and Mermentau headwaters Huck 8. So these are kind of the first ones we started working on. Just slightly behind that is going to be our Mermentau watershed. This one admittedly has been giving us a little bit of trouble. It's very complex hydraulically, a lot of slow velocities and kind of bathtubs effects that we've been working through and trying to troubleshoot, but making good progress on that, hoping to have that calibrated and validated in early September. And then lastly, we have our Bayou Teche and Vermilion watersheds. These were kind of the ones that we highlighted for last, knowing that there was going to be a lot of input into those from the survey perspective. This is really, looking at Region 5 where the population base is and where we have a lot of, potential losses from flooding effects. These are kind of be the 2 watersheds really that highlight that. So we wanted to make sure that we had enough time to collect the survey and properly integrate that into our modeling efforts. So we're looking at that later in the year, October, November timeframe. Ultimately, you can see the final deadline here, January 31st, 2024. So this should be kind of where we're, ready to start, doing the applications and things like that, like Billy was talking about. So I'll kind of break this down where we've been through the project thus far, really starting at the data collection phase. We're talking about models and all this stuff, and it is a huge modeling effort, but not to be understated here is the amount of data collection, in particular survey that the program has been undertaking. So Billy mentioned the LiDAR already. Region 5, we have a pretty good data set already. You can see the different data sources that we have here, really collected the majority from 2017 to 2019. We did have a couple issues in the Atchafalaya Basin where we had to make some resolutions to address that. And so we did end up using the 2012, 2013 data set for that, but it should be collected in the next probably year or so, something like that, which we can update in the future. But kind of the main takeaway here, this is quality topographic data. It's new topographic data. We're looking at 10 centimeters. This is kind of the air that we're talking about, kind of on average, about this much as far as like vertical accuracy goes. And when you think about that over the whole kind of statewide area, Region 5 as well, it's pretty good. All things considered, it's going to give us a pretty good base to build our hydraulic models on. Next thing as far as data collection goes is the high watermark assessments. Talk about calibration and validation. How do you know that your models are good? Well, you got to have some actual observed data to gauge how well you're matching. And one of these sources that we use is high watermark collection. And what we've done is we've we've identified certain events that we're calibrating and validating to, which I'll get into later on in this. But we picked those events in part because we had available data to use, and that's a lot of this high watermark validation. So the way that we validated this data, we essentially, used common sense for the most part. You got higher elevations upstream, lower elevations downstream. Does the high water marks, does it make sense like that? Are we seeing kind of the drop of water as you move down to the watershed? When you have clusterings of points, are they all about the same elevation? That kind of thing. So that was kind of our first screening pass to make sure that we were using good data. As far as the amount of data that we have here, you can see that in total, we have about 374 points that can be useful. Of those, 343 of these are classified as good or better. So what that means is we're actually going to be referencing these. These are going to be kind of the metric for model quality as far as calibration and validation goes. The data originally itself, you have to give thanks to CPRA, Fenstermaker, and USGS. They really did a good job of collecting this initially. They shared the data with us, so we're very grateful to have that available to us. And you can see just kind of across these graphs here, the events that we're modeling here and the amount of data that we have. Obviously, the 2016 event has the most data, and that's going to be probably one of our most critical events that we work with. Getting onto the survey. So this was I think a monumental effort, number one, and just let's figure out what's available already. So one of the biggest sources of data for us that was free, readily available, all it required for us was to download and process it, was the Corps of Engineers New Orleans District navigation data. So you can see here, the total mileage that we have available to us that we were able to download and process. This doesn't include survey and bathymetry that we were able to extract from the FEMA models and other models that were already available. This is just the stuff from the Corps of Engineers here. So the image on the right is what this looks like in PDF form and the raw format from the Corps' website. And this is what it looks like in our model. So this is the Chaffalaya River, just kind of downstream of Crotch Springs. So you can see here, looking at the aerial imagery, a lot of vegetation, really kind of hard to see what's going on underneath there. Obviously, you got full riverbank, so a lot of flow going through there. So we can look at on the next image, on the overbanks here. This is the LiDAR data that we're talking about here. So you can see a bunch of little channels. If you were to take a boat through there, you could probably make your way through there. Hard to see in the aerials, but this is what our model's seeing. So it's really high quality data. Gives us a pretty good understanding of how flow is going to pass through this area, not only here, but in other parts of Region 5 too. And we can also see the bathymetry from the previous slide, how it's incorporated into the model. So I'm showing a bend right here because this is kind of a good place you'd expect the velocity to pick up as it goes around the bend right. You can see a little bit of a scour hole kind of digging out on the bend right there, which is, representative of what you would expect in kind of the real world conditions. And then lastly, this is just a cross-sectional view of this. So if you look at the red kind of cross of the two images on the left, this is what the model's seeing. We actually have about 100-foot channel depth right here. So pretty interesting, pretty deep, have a lot of locations throughout, all of the models where we have this type of quality of data incorporated into it. So the other side of this, you have channel bathymetry. What about the structures? I'm talking about habitable structures with consequence modeling. Here we're talking about your bridges, your culverts, your pumps, things like that. This is the type of information that we're going out and surveying, and we're also lifting this from previous models as well too. We're validating previous models, so making sure that previous efforts are being incorporated into our LWI modeling as well. So as I mentioned before, with testing per million, kind of the ones we staggered last, you can see we have a pretty significant amount of structures being incorporated into this. On the right-hand side here, these are actual HECRAS model bridge coatings. So the bridge to the north, I believe, is in Mermentau Headwaters watershed. It's just kind of a standard, typical bridge, nothing too special per se. The one on the bottom is actually on the Chaffalaya. It's the causeway there, so you can see, significant amount of piers, a lot of a lot of effort went into collecting that and putting it into the model. So it's really good, accurate representation of the structural data that's out there. And it's going to give us a good idea of the hydraulics around there as well. So the survey itself, I want to give a quick shout out to our team on Region 5 with CDC, PAE, and Fenstermaker as well. They're really instrumental in helping us collect survey, throughout the entire watershed. So great effort on that. It pretty much finished at this point. I think we should be wrapping up their deliverable here pretty soon, to where the survey data will be, pretty much LWI owned at this point. But I do want to highlight some of the more advanced technologies that we're using here. And one of these is our drone LiDAR. So we essentially have some surveyors, you go out there, they have these unmanned drones essentially flying around and taking LiDAR imagery of these. And these are some of the outputs here. You can see you get kind of a vertical point cloud on the top here. This is like elevation, red being higher elevations, obviously. And on the bottom, these are the types of things that we're calling out and putting into our model because they are hydraulically important. So we got a couple of videos here, kind of impressive work that these drones have. This is us rendering. I think this is the Abbeville Bridge over the Vermilion, if I recall correctly. You can see the type of information that can be obtained for this. So really, number one behind this is the elevation that we showed on the previous slide, but we're also draping the photogrammetry on top of it. So while this is important to the modeling effort, be thinking about how else you can potentially use this in, other facets, not necessarily related to H&H modeling or flood risk, but there's probably some applications like related to, building new structures, inventorying like existing future issues, things like that. So a lot of powerful ways I think you can use these tools will be made available. Here's another rendering of this. This is in the Bayou-Teche watershed. This is a smaller bridge, but you can see the type of information picked up. One of the reasons that we did these drone LiDARs as well too, as you all know, access to a lot of these structures is extremely difficult. It can be dangerous with high water. Just getting a boat in, you have currents within the river, and it's not really feasible to get in there. So these drone LiDARs was a good way to collect a lot of data pretty quickly and get a lot of information that could be useful to things outside of modeling. I think this is just the way that they tried, our team tried to make it look pretty. So
Eric, on previous slide back when you had the map, the imagery of elevation and which river you had mentioned, you had a cross section across, but it was mapped out. So how does that LiDAR work with a canopy to collect that kind of data?
So there's actually technology in the way that they collect the LiDAR where there's different codes for different data sources.
So identifying species that
it's identifying vegetation. So it's saying this is vegetation, this might be a structure, this might be like impervious area. And then the ones that we're concerned with and the way that we're processing it is the bare earth return. So what it's essentially able to pierce through the canopy, the vegetation, and return the bare earth. So it is difficult in some areas like the Atchafalaya. I think that's where we encountered some issues with the LiDAR data set because
as well, if the water is high, the more.
Yeah, that's a big thing too.
And one of the things that we found with Atchafalaya and other LiDAR that affects this is it is very, very, very crucial to fly your LiDAR at the right time. Make sure you're not in a flood. Make sure the trees aren't full of leaves so that you can get more of that penetration through it.
So we can show you these pretty images, right? But who's really going to use this? Who's going to have this software necessarily? And we want to keep in mind end users as well and how they might use this data. So this is actually raw survey data in ARC Pro format. And this is what we're using as a team to model this. And this is, I think, what would be useful to end users down the road too. So essentially thin out this LiDAR data set throw it in your map, and you can get in here and work with this data. You can see here's at the Sorrel Bridge over Tesh. Same data as the previous video, but this is like actually using it. So we're zooming in here. You can see can be a little bit slow at times, but pretty solid altogether. So a lot of different ways you can use this, and it's going to zoom in here and it's going to show how you can like pick off elevations here. So this is the type of stuff that we were doing. Think about how you might be able to use this for bridge inspections, or like, let's say a boat hits a pier or something and you want to say, hey, what are the effects? Did we have a drop in our low chord or something like this? So there's a couple other ways, a couple different uses of this that can be used. Maybe you want to do a risk presentation of like, hey, like Billy was mentioning, depth times velocity. You can use this information to convey risk and things like that too. So pretty powerful data set. Really something I think only available in the last few years. So we're happy to be able to use it. I know some other regions are using it as well too. So here's measuring distances and things like that as well too. All right, so the modeling approach. So it really was a monumental effort scoping this out. I think initially, Region 5 is a very big area. And really what we focused on initially was trying to understand, where the most risk is at. So risk is obviously a function of probability times consequences. So we really wanted to highlight the areas where, you're gonna have a lot of, potential property damages, potential loss of life, a lot of old flood, national flood insurance program claims, things like that, where FEMA floodplains mapped already, because there's probably a reason they're doing that. So trying to reproduce that. And we really wanted to, invest the funds in survey collection and modeling in those areas to get the most bang for the buck. And I think most important about this is what we're saying in Region 5, that this is a consistent and replicated approach statewide for the LWI program. So these are a couple of the things, and I'll just go through these pretty quickly of the data sets we looked at. And I think you all should have seen something very similar to this in kind of the original presentations, a couple of years ago about, what's the risk to Region 5, where are the problem areas. So here we're looking at National Flood Insurance Program claims on the left, insured values on the right. So again, just kind of a mark on the parcel block area, neighborhood block area of like property values and things like that, kind of a high level structure inventory. Another thing we looked at is the FEMA risk counts. This was a indices that FEMA has generated to say, hey, these are the areas where you should expect to see issues with flooding and things like that, socioeconomic risk, things that you can't necessarily quantify just by looking at floodplains. So we took all that data, took a lot of the information that the LWI program generated initially, and we created this map on the right, which is our flood weighted risk indice. And you can see here that it makes sense logically if you're thinking about like where the majority of like population may be. Obviously like Lafayette is going to drive Vermilion to be the most risk prone. So we kind of highlighted this, took this information into account, and this is how we developed this original scope like we were talking about. So this is a key concept right here, our tiered modeling approach. So it's important to note, Region 5 is a big area. Not every like square inch is going to have the same level of detail as other areas. So again, we focus the efforts in the high detail areas. These are going to be, the most flood prone areas, losses, things like that. So what are you going to get in a high detail zone area? This is going to be, to take FEMA terminology, this is going to be very similar to a zone AE detailed study. If you're going to do like a floodway analysis, this is kind of the level that you need to do to support that analysis. Full on survey, 2D models are going to have 20 to 200 foot cell grid cell sizes. So really detailed information on a smaller scale. The medium detail, this is going to be kind of consistent with FEMA Zone AE limited detail studies. So these are going to be the areas where you have like a BFE, you're pretty confident in it. There is some survey incorporated with it, but not as much as in full detail. There are going to be structures included, but they're going to be more estimated based on like photogrammetry, aerial imagery, things like that. maybe we go out there with the tape measure. That's a 10-foot box, something like that, rather than like drones or using GPS or something like that. So more of a roughing approach. 200 to 500 foot grid cell sizes. And then lastly is the low detailed areas. And this is going to be, FEMA Zone A approximate studies, kind of consistent with like the FEMA BLE approaches, similar style of model, similar style of output, things like that. What's important to note though, is that these can be upgraded at any point. Like this is base level modeling. If there's a need in the future to say, hey, we want to put a new project over in this area, but it's low detail, well, totally acceptable, totally easy. Well, I should say necessarily easy, but totally that's something that you can do to go collect more survey, put some more detail, maybe do some more some gauge analysis or something like that, put a stream monitor in there to be confident in the flows and things like that, upgrade that, and now you have a more consistent detail model. It's really just, at its core, it's a tool to be used. And it depends on, really what Region 5 wants to do with it. So, I mean, you can keep upgrading it, keep sustaining it, you can keep it on the shelf, probably not ideal, but it is something that can be improved upon in the future and definitely benefit quite a bit. This is just kind of a tabular format of this. Nothing new to add on this slide, just another way to present data. If anyone's looking at like PDFs of this later on, might be a useful approach here. So hydrology. Again, this is our flows. Essentially is what we're trying to get through here. But how do we first start with hydrology? Billy was mentioning historic events. This is what we're going to kind of test our models with, make sure that we're able to reproduce what happened before so that we can have confidence moving forward. So when we get into design applications, 100-year flood, that type of thing, that we have confidence that we have a solid baseline model to work with. So you can see here on this slide, this is all the USGS gauge locations throughout the watershed that have some National Weather Service, AHAPS, essentially flood stage related information. The colors on the right, these are the flood stages that National Weather Service uses. So, you're ranging from major flood to action stage. And really what we're trying to do is give us a robust kind of data set to work with, so we understand what's going on and kind of some minor flooding all the way up to the major flooding events. And we wanted to, kind of pepper that throughout all 5 HUCs in Region 5 to make sure we have a solid understanding of, a wide range of flow conditions that the watersheds might experience. So we ultimately settled on these events right here to run. So all of the coastal regions 4, 5, 6, and 7, we're all doing 4 tropical storms and 4 non-tropical storms. So these were the events that we selected. We're working with TWI to get us coastal modeling results from their AdCirc models to couple these up to make sure that we have a good understanding of what's happening on the coastal side. So again, here's our events. This is the type of information that we're looking at here. And I'm just going to go through these quickly. So this is total precipitation that we're seeing. We're using something called the AORC data set, which is a radar. It's essentially a radar-based precipitation data set. So we have, I think it's at every 2,000 square kilometers. We have like a point of data. To make it, I guess, in simpler terms, you watch the local news and you see the radar kind of like going across the screen. We're essentially putting that into our model, so we have that spatial variability, intensities that we're able to accurately gauge what's happening across the watershed. So starting with our first 2 events here, we got Gustav and Barry. You can see they really, as far as precipitation depths, hit the northern part of Region 5. The other 2 we're doing is Laura and Delta. These are a little bit more western, still to the north a bit more as far as, and this is just precipitation depths. Our non-tropical events, we're doing October 2015 and flood record in 16. So again, 15 is probably one of our smaller events as far as understanding what's going on at the lower end. And then May 2017 and May 2020. So all in all, if you kind of flip through these quickly, maybe not quickly on the screen, just looking at the red blots, kind of peppering around the watershed. This is the kind of spatial variability that we're working with to try and understand what we're doing on the modeling side. So getting into the hydrologic modeling approach, this is, I suppose, getting into the weeds a little bit more. I think Garland hit on this a little bit as far as what hydrologic modeling is. So there's really three different methodologies here. The first one is a standard HMS modeling. This is essentially you're in the HEC HMS software. Let's say you have a sub-basin here, you know it generates 100 CFS, and you have another location 2 miles downstream. And it's a very simple approach. You generate your flow, you know the time it takes to travel 2 miles downstream, it's 1 hour. That's how you're routing it. It's more of a streamlined approach, a quicker approach, efficient, and it's really, I guess, suitable to testing out design storm applications, and it's really a useful tool for kind of understanding, baseline calibrations, because you can run a lot of stuff pretty quickly, get a good understanding of what's going on within the watershed. Really only appropriate in areas where it's not complex hydraulically. Upland areas like Mermentau headwaters is a pretty good example of that, where flow paths are pretty well defined for the most part. The upper reaches of the Vermilion and Tesh as well have a couple areas like this, and this is where we're focusing on this type of information. The coupled approach, so this is still using HMS. We're still generating runoff in the hydrologic software, but we don't understand the hydraulic routing. It's too complex. We need a model for that. So here what we're doing is we're taking those inflows, plugging it into a RAS model, either 1D unsteady or 2D model, and we're routing it that way. So that way we can get an understanding of how flow interacts, backwater interactions, things like that. It gives us a better gauge of how water is moving and attenuating throughout the watershed. And lastly, this is the rain on grid. This is I guess, all the rage in industry these days. It's becoming more and more accepted. I think more and more commonplace. This is basically, we're going to do all this in the HEC-RAS software. We're going to put our infiltration information. We're going to put our precipitation information. We're going to generate all this all together, route it at the same time. Gives you a better understanding of, local runoffs and things like that. I think moving forward, 5-10 years, this will probably be pretty standard throughout FEMA and other approaches. So HMS modeling, these are the methods that we're using. I feel like this is, you talk about modeling, you need to talk about how you're doing it, but I'm just going to kind of breeze over this. There's infiltration methods that you need to use. This is the actual way we're doing this. Thing to note about this, though, is this is consistent for the most part across all 7 regions. This is guidance developed by the LWI program in the TDQ. This is kind of our market consistency across the regions, so that, you go into region 4, you're going to get pretty much the same thing as you have in region 5. So you have that kind of reciprocity and things like that. So we'll get into the model itself now, kind of show you what is being created and what some of the inputs and outputs look like. So here we're showing the Mermentau headwaters. This is one of our regions where we're just doing it purely in HMS. This is going to be one of our most critical HUCs to use for calibration and validation, primarily because it's the only one that has pretty much gauge data that is non-influenced by coastal influences or water flowing lateral. Like, we know where water's coming at in the headwaters. We have good gauge data. This is how we're going to calibrate our infiltration losses. This is how we're going to calibrate our time of concentrations and things like that. And then we're going to take this information and we're going to, use it in other watersheds where we're doing rain on grid and more advanced hydrologic techniques. Use those scaling factors, essentially create like a regional regression so that we have confidence in like the Atchafalaya, Lower Vermilion, Mermentau. If you have understanding of how infiltration and things like that work in region 5. So as far as sub-basin delineation goes, we tried for a 1 to 5 square mile target. So pretty detailed information. And this is just the image on the right is what the HMS model looks like. So these are all essentially sub-basin inputs. The thing to note about this, though, is we're using distributed modeling techniques. So essentially what we're doing is if you call back to the LiDAR, you have an idea of what's going on, 5 feet here, 10 feet there. You have like spatial variability, and our models are able to replicate this and incorporate that for other parameters, including precipitation, the gridded canopy. We're using, photogrammetry, satellite imagery, things like that into our models. Looking at the impervious area, it's another key data set, and then the gridded soils data. So that's the image on the right. So you can see, looking at the floodplains, knowing how flow works within the Mermentau headwaters, you're obviously going to have, I guess, clayier soils or more loss adverse soils in the rivers. And you can kind of see that right in this image on the far right. This is the type of information that we're using and able to replicate. So we have a strong understanding of the underlying hydrologic parameters. We did do some gridded sensitivity. Essentially, you take some native resolution data. It's going to be in some like 10-meter resolution. That's not necessarily efficient as far as model runs go. So we did do some sensitivity to kind of optimize the results to ensure faster runtimes, I should say, while not losing quality of results. So you can see this is kind of the difference of taking native resolution, going to 100 meters, all the way to the rise on 1,000 meters. It's basically taking squares, 100-meter squares, all the way to 1,000-meter squares. And this is the simplifications and things like that occur. So we can show some model results. This is actual model output. So the image or video on the left is going to be precipitation, cumulative as it goes for, I believe this is delta across the watershed. So you can see kind of the spatial variability and depths across. And the image on the right is going to be cumulative soil loss. So this is essentially, you have a dry soil, you put 6 inches of rain on it. Let's say 3 inches is going to be lost to the soil, and the other 3 inches are going to be generated as runoff. This is kind of the output that we're showing right here. So it's kind of a mark of antecedent soil conditions and a mark of your soils, mark of your impervious area. This is essentially the final product to help you understand how rain is reacting in your watershed. Talking about model calibration, Billy mentioned this initially. There's a lot of different parameters that you need to tweak to understand what's going on within the models. Don't necessarily need to get into too much right now, just talking about model outputs, but the key thing here is that we're doing a sensitivity analysis and understanding, like, is the infiltration rate the most important thing? Is the impervious area the most important thing? Is it the time it takes to move from point A to point B in the watershed? Is that most important? We're getting a good understanding of that so we can have an accurate representation of what's actually occurring. So the image on the left here, this is how we tell if a hydrologic model is calibrated. Essentially, does your flow hydrograph, and flow hydrograph essentially is, the increase in flow over a period of time, does that match what happened in the real world? So you can see on the left-hand side there, for the 3 gauging locations in the headwaters, how well the model is performing at this point. So this is the August 2016 and Hurricane Laura. So you can see pretty well performance as far as runoff goes. And again, what's key about this, we're confident in the volume that the floods are generated, but we're also confident in we talked about like the channel bathymetry and the structure information and the LiDAR. We can be confident in like it's being routed properly, and we have an understanding of how this volume is actually performing in the real world. And this is just some model outputs. Won't go over this. I think this has been kind of hit already, but here's a snapshot of the 3 systems within the Mermentau headwaters kind of coming together at the I-10 bridge here. So this is one of our model outputs, hydraulic model outputs. I think we're showing velocities here in the flow paths, those traces you can see. This is how water moves. We have another image like this, or another video. I think that's probably better. We'll get into that later. It's more representative, I guess, of the outputs that we can talk about. So getting into hydraulics, this is also a requisite HECRAS slide that I think we've used in the past. I know other firms have used it in the past too. It's kind of the standard that you put. But essentially with HECRAS, mentioned its benefit of being free. It also has capabilities of being 1D modeling and 2D modeling. I think Garland kind of hit on this before. 1D is essentially a cross-section to cross-section. The flow goes from cross-section, on down the line. 2D, very simply stated, is each grid cell is a cross section. So let's say in 10 miles of stream, you have, cross section every mile, you have 10 kind of snapshots of how the topography and how the channel may be performing. In a 2D model, you may have hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of cells. So you get a more kind of refined idea of how flow is interacting with your topography. And it gives you a good idea of how the system is performing. Couple key things to look at here is break lines. Essentially, you mentioned cross sections, grid cell faces being cross sections. If you don't have a break line to enforce a grid cell face on an important topographic feature, the model won't see that. And this is the type of thing when we talk about detail, you need to put break lines into the models to ensure that you're capturing topographic features, because that's going to influence the way that flow goes. So this is the type of thing that we're working on right now. This is the type of thing that if you wanted to put more detail in the future, you would add more of these. Model refinements, you can have more detailed parameters like Garland was mentioning, Manning's land use values, things like that. You can have varying grid cell sizes throughout your domain. You can have, 6 cells across the river in one location, and then you can, go from 20 foot to 200 foot, whatever is suitable for the condition. So there is some flexibility as far as model detail goes. Integration of existing models. Again, mentioned this before, but not only is the data collection effort, do we not want to discard previously useful models? We want to incorporate those as best we can. This is an example of that in the Cooley mean. So on the bottom right, this is the FEMA 1D model that we leveraged. So you can see that you have I think this is West Cooley mean and Cooley mean near the confluence. Previously, there was no interaction between the two systems in the 1D environment. Well, we've essentially taken that information, taken those surveys, put it into 2D model, and now we can understand flow interactions and get a better flow mixings, things like that, get a better idea of what's going on. I do want to call out some of the bigger models that we've used and some of the more influential models that we were able to leverage, including the FEMA regulatory models, primarily from LCG. The ULL 1D, 2D model of Vermilion has been super useful, and the Corps of Engineers SLAIN model, which is essentially a Chafalaya, the coastal regions of Region 5. We were able to leverage a lot of data from that. And then there's a lot of support from, local consultants, local parishes, local communities. Hey, we got this little model. Can you use this? And we were able to extract some information from those as well. So breakout modeling, I think this is a key component to suitability and applicability after the fact. So on the image on the right, this is the headwaters again, and you can see what we're doing as one of our deliverables. We're one big model essentially, like that it's going to have this entire area, but we're going to have the flexibility to see these different polygons. These are going to be our breakout areas, so that the future user, if you wanted to get a better understanding of what's going on the smaller scale, you could take out some of these smaller areas and maybe just look at the bottom confluence area if you wanted to, or maybe just focus on the upper headwaters reaches. So there's some flexibility in how these models can be operated. These are just a couple slides as far as how that might look. I have a couple examples here. This is from a high detailed area in the Vermilion model. So the Cooley-Ile-de-Cans, 55 hydraulic structures. This is what it would look like if you just wanted to work on this particular watershed. A lot of detailed structure information incorporated into this model. The image on the right talked about like varying cell resolutions, varying details within a 2D model. This is kind of an example of what that looks like. The Vermilion River, the image on the left, you can see kind of that black highlighted area. That's where we're talking about right here. So in that area, we're looking at 240 hydraulic structures, and mentioned break lines as like enforcing topographic features is kind of a mark of detail. A lot of detail in this particular section. This is how it would look broken out, and this is the type of information being put into it. Mentioned rain on grid. So these are a couple model, I'll wrap up here with model outputs. This is, I believe, in the Vermilion watershed too, in the coastal regions. So again, rain on grid, essentially putting precipitation into the hydraulic model. Infiltration losses are happening in the hydraulic model, and routing is happening in the model. And this is kind of what it looks like as a flood event. The August 2016 event occurs over this particular area. So you can see that we're getting pretty good understanding of what's happening on a pretty large scale. Have more model results. So this is what precipitation looks like. Mention radar data and like the local news. This is again what the model's seeing. We're showing our Mermentau Huckade on the bottom left here. So again, this is the type of spatial variability, good understanding temporally and spatially what's happening as far as precipitation goes. Really a testament to the quality of data, again, that's being input into these models. Here we're looking at precipitation, but just kind of a marker of model input parameters. And this is a kind of still of the cumulative precipitation for August 2016. So I think we've all seen this image before, but again, this is what the model's seeing. Very accurate representation, at least precipitation wise, of what occurred for that event. One of the cooler new features that we're working with is wind forcing. So thanks to TWI on this in their AdCirc modeling, we were able to work with them and extract wind from the coastal models and apply them within our hydraulic models. So showing Barra here, stopping at this point, this is before the event really occurs. And the point here is if you saw those particle tracings were essentially going out to the coast, essentially sucking out before the event comes in. So kind of make note of that mentally. We'll proceed on. If you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, there's some numbers. This is the actual wind speeds that are occurring. So you can see the events coming up and we're raising. So we're what, 65, 66 miles per hour right now. You can see the eye coming in.
So you captured
Which blows the water around.
yes, we saw that in that Mermentau basin that localized. When we plugged in the wind factors, changed everything.
Yep. So
So the models are seeing this in real time. Each of the cells are seeing it in real time. So whatever happens to change the water surface with that wind forcing affects the others, and the model sees that. Really affects your calibration, your validation of the model, and the code, particularly in the first one.
So I'll move on here for time considerations. This is the same event. Remember when I paused it earlier, this is the Atchafalaya right here. What we're showing now, this is a velocity, this is model output. This is a velocity tracing that we're showing. Blue is lower velocities, oranges are higher velocities. Before the event starts, we're going out to the Gulf, which probably makes sense. Kind of keep an eye on the colors. We're pretty consistent right now. There's some surge occurring right now. Pretty common flow paths going. It's going to progress. So now we can see the hurricane's getting a little bit closer. The velocity kind of pushing up and changing considerations here. We'll turn on the particle tracing, and now look how things have changed. And what really stands out to me now is you see kind of in the central area, the blue area, there's kind of a spinning going on right there. This is essentially an eddy occurring because you have water pushing up through the coast.
Between the Atchafalaya and the Wax Lake Outlet.
So we're going up the
South
two reaches right there. We hit the levee right there. You can see kind of the orange mark to the south there. The water in the middle can't go anywhere, so it's essentially circulating, and what could be happening is you could have like sediment dropping out and things like that. But this is kind of getting to the coastal part. I'll turn it over to you, Garland, to kind of wrap up for us.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And so one of the phenomena you could see is water actually pushing up the Atchafalaya. The high velocities on the vectors on the right are basically pushing up. And then you could see the water being forced westerly. Just to give you, we are, obviously this presentation is not associated with findings, right? But couple of high level observations of somebody who was born in that little city and then raised in that little green space in the middle in Patterson. The one things that is obvious with the modeling we're doing in making informed decisions at a regional scale. By the way, the Corps is very interested in the work we're doing in Region 5 because they want to use this to expand the West of Chapala study. They're waiting for us to finish our models so that they're not stepping on top of us at the same time. But one of the things that we're seeing is how the role of GIWW is changing, right? It's becoming a drainage artery as water tries to go in the Gulf. But with the Gulf Stream eddy loop and those sort of things, you're seeing the increased water surface elevation. So the GIWW is becoming a big drainage artery to the west. It tries to get out here, it tries to get out, it just keeps moving westerly. But yes, this is
Well, first thing I see with this, importance is the infrastructure. A surge like this is contained. Or is there a gap?
no, you're seeing, yeah, the surge is basically saying nothing can come down to Chapala. And look what's happening on the north side. I mean, it's and so let me go into so how are we want to leave time for Brett to present since you drove a long way to get here. We in the coastal transition zones, we have this really incredible phenomena, right? I can have a gauge at a location, and there's one that Dr. Habib had, I forget which coulee it was on, but for the period that he was monitoring it, the starting water surface could be 16 to 26, depending on whether the event was a rain event, whether it was a storm surge, etc. The flow could be going in the coulee, the flow could be coming out of the coulee, and in the thousands of CFS. So we have this very complex region in the coastal transition zones that you see. So we had the coastal transition zone consultants, those that each one is sort of different, but we probably have more similarity to the Fence-to-Maker region in 4. 6 has the Barataria estuary, so I mean they've got a really huge coastal zone in Terrebonne Parish, etc. But the coastal models that are being run, the AdCirc SWAN models that basically start all the way in the Atlantic Ocean and go include all of the Gulf of Mexico, those really have, they're picking up the ocean currents, etc., the wind field forcings, the pressure. And so they're modeling the water levels in the Gulf of Mexico and along the coastline fairly accurately. As you go inland and you have this flow coming, let's just pick on your area, the Mermentau, and you've got water that's trying to move in and you got water that's trying to move out in 2016. Where is that boundary? And then how do we couple those models for the purposes of modeling existing conditions? So this slide basically shows some sensitivity runs. Well, where is the riverine dominating? Where is the surge dominating? And we looked at the data from the AdCirc SWAN models, and then we looked at the data from observed conditions, and we looked at data from RAS. And then this basically overlaps.
We have a question in the chat from Monique. On that screen, is Morgan City in the model, or is there just no water over the populated area?
So when I was growing up in Morgan City, the seawall was 3 foot tall, 4 foot tall. Now it's 32 feet. The boundary of our model and where region 6 picks up is basically Morgan City. Morgan City is in the region next to us. So they're modeling Morgan City. We're not. But for our purposes, what our model is seeing is that flood wall, the 30-something foot flood wall that's keeping the water in the what we found is there's a series of locks. The connection, because of the east Atchafalaya levee, the flood wall in Morgan City, the Bayou Shen closure, the lock, the Bayou Beth lock, there's a fairly hard boundary line between us and Region 6. So there's not a lot of, there is some water moving in there. Did I answer her question? Okay, she'll let you know. So what we came up with was the RAS 6.3 version allows us to put a varying spatiotemporal boundary on our models. And what does that mean? It means I can put in data over a boundary that varies in water surface elevation relative to location and time. So I can take from the Water Institute models, I can go just offshore to about a 2-meter depth where the waves that are coming in are just starting to fill the bottom and start to in shallow water start to break. We did some sensitivity runs and found that that was a very good location to set as the limits of our RAS model. What we've done, the Water Institute was able to model not only the tropical events, but also the non-tropical events over that period of time in AdCirc Swan. We extract that data and the RAS model sees that water surface elevation at that point in time and basically reads that as a boundary condition. So that's the way we're coupling our model, our riverine models relative to the coastal models. To the best of my knowledge, and I don't want to take anything from Brett's presentation, but I know from my knowledge, this is the first time this has been done. It's a very solid connection. It's easily replicated. It maximizes the use of the CPRA models in the coastal environment and the riverine. So this shows you basically how a time stack of how the surge varies for a given event, and I forget which event Adam Keene picked on this, but you can see the red line in the upper left is where we came out with as the best location. We're not modeling Marsh Island. There's not a lot happening in Marsh Island that really affects what we're doing. And if we included Marsh Island and Vermilion Bay in our model, then all of a sudden we're getting into that where coastal does the better job of replicating what's going on. But we're hugging that west side of Southwest Pass. And I can tell you one of the things that the model's definitely showing us is that as more water tries to come out of Wax Lake Outlet into GIWW, into Vermilion Bay, Southwest Pass on Vermilion Bay is becoming a very big hole and a much bigger hole. More and more water's trying to get out and squeeze out through that location. That much is obvious. And then this is basically how the wave heights stack along the. So this is, we did some boundary sensitivity, won't go in those details here, but you can see the red line is where we looked at where's the best place to put this line, and what we determine is the 2-meter depth is the best place to say this is where we're going to pick up the coastal model data and input it into the RAS model data. And so a lot of the modeling effect that you saw on the slide that Eric showed in the Atchafalaya, it's seeing that boundary condition, right? From the AdCirc Swan models for Barry, it's picking that up as input, which is why you see water going north and trying to basically block out the Atchafalaya. So this is the boundary we ended up picking. You can see the Vermilion there. And what we wanted to do is confirm that the RAS model is seeing the boundary data from the AdCirc model. And so this is basically confirming that what we have, you can see the AdCirc is in basically the circles and the RAS is the lines. And so you can see that for this given event for Gustav, RISE is this very great version that really changed our ability to model these coastal transition zones. The 6.3 is accurately reading that data from the AdCert. So I'm David, hand it to you at this point.
All right, I'll be brief. I want to leave plenty of time for Brett and for other questions. Henry Consulting's been asked to handle the model use portion of this program. That is what happens after the model is completed, validated, and released. And I think I want to talk about a two-phase approach to this. Everything I say here is provisional. It's months away from implementation, but we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about it so that I could plant the seeds in your mind and begin to collect feedback from you on how you would like this to be usable and useful and helpful to all of you. Next slide, please. The challenge is, and I think many of you probably got a glimpse of this from Garland's and Eric's presentation, is that full model use is an extremely demanding and complex effort requiring a lot of training and practice, but that the LWI program has an interest in maximizing the benefit of models for everyone, for a wide variety of users, even those who are not civil engineers or trained in the software. And so I have today a preliminary recommendation that we develop a dual path for model use based on the different audiences who may see value in it. The plan's under development. We're months away. OCD will make the final decisions, but my contact information is on the last slide. And if you have thoughts about this, feel free to share them with me. At some point, I'll probably send out a survey to all of the contacts on today's meeting, asking for input about what kind of data they'd like to see. So there's still plenty of input, plenty of time for input. Next slide. The first path's technical audiences. Frankly, I think you already know who you are. They are, I'll read them quickly: the civil engineering profession, academics, technical staff, other state departments in state government, and then other governmental agencies like the Corps of Engineers and FEMA. It's certainly not limited to that, but I'm aware that significant training in the software is probably, I say probably, necessary in order to make full use of access to the model itself. Next slide. But we're going to do a couple things at the state to make sure that even this process goes well. There will be an invitation and recruitment process. I hope not to leave anyone out, but everyone who is in those populations will be notified and encouraged to spread the word. There will be a training program, the nature of it to be determined. Some of the engineers I've spoken with indicated that for the vast majority of you who understand the HEC products, that training may not be necessary, but we're going to have it just in case to run through a couple of examples. I anticipate some kind of help desk for people who are struggling with using the model. There should be, I think, some quality control to make sure that the model runs that are used to defend public policy decisions have actually been done correctly. And then we'll have trouble reports for people who are actually, for the occasions when the model isn't working up to snuff, and may need some fixes. And then, of course, model maintenance. There'll be upgrades and notifications over time as the model is changed and developed and intensified. Next slide, please. But I want to say to the rest of you, you're not alone. I am not a hydrological or model user, but we will make sure that there are products from the data collection, from the surveys, and from model runs that can help the rest of us. That could include many people who are on this call today, policymakers at the steering committees and coalitions, the coordinators, elected officials, senior staff in municipalities, the industries and professions involved in land use, and any other stakeholders. And I left the skills required section blank because I don't want to presume a skill set for the audiences who will need this. All are welcome, and the job will be to develop something that's helpful to you. Next page. I like to use the word critical success factors. These are the things that we need to do well in order to make sure that this works for you, our user base. We'll begin with a thorough assessment of what the most valuable outputs would be. Both Garland and Eric refer to this as a data repository. I'm using the term library. It's the same thing. These will be reports that will be accessible online. I think we'll also have a process for adding to that library over time as new ideas come up. I think we'll need to clearly explain what each of the reports might be used for, and there'll be a point of contact for any users who have questions about the data or the model runs. I'm going to pause here. Does anybody have any questions about this so far? No? Next slide, please. Okay. Like I said, we're months away from releasing this. It probably will not be released until the model is turned over. That's when the training and the access to the repository will begin. I not only encourage your input, but I need it. My contact information is here. The survey will go out a few months from now when we have a better idea of what likely products will be. And that is, I am done. Eric, turn it over to Brett.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Brett McMahon. I'm a civil engineer at the Water Institute of the Gulf. And our role in this program is, we have a number of roles, I should say, and I serve as our project manager across all of them, but it's really to support, kind of be in the background to support each of the groups like HDR, who's doing the modeling in the different regions. And I'm going to try to cover as quickly as I can to leave time for questions and discussion, three tasks or three topics today. So the first one is, and you've heard this as a repetitive theme, all this data that's being collected, all these models that are being built are intended for many, they're intended to be the starting spot for many derivative uses, some which we may not even be able to imagine today. And so how do we make these things discoverable and accessible? That could go down to very mundane questions of like, what should the folder structure be for the 9 teams turning stuff in? And should it be, how do we make it consistent so that someone in the future who's looking for something in one region can, equally as easily find something in a different region that they might be looking for? To bigger picture issues of, well, who controls the access and what are the governance questions and on when we should update these things and who does that? Yeah. And so you see this acronym, which stands for model use, storage, and maintenance. And it's really the, an effort to develop the plan on how the state really best leverages this huge investment they're making in collecting all this data and assembling all these models so that they're as broadly usable and accessible as possible in the future. Just some background, the thinking around this topic has been ongoing for a couple of years now at various levels within the LWI, like the working group, who are the kind of collection of state agency representatives right under the Watershed Council who meet regularly to discuss and make decisions. The TDQ, which is kind of like technical data and modeling advisory group. And so a number of different approaches have been debated and technical solutions have been debated and vetted. And the group is coalesced around a strategy, which I'll try to summarize, and I think the regional watershed coordinators have heard some of this previously. But in essence, I use an analogy of a library, right? Like right now, in the engineering and science world, someone has a problem, they want to analyze it. Like we're getting on the phone with HDR, who might be calling fence maker, hey, did you do this thing here? Oh, no, that was UL. Like there's no place consistently in our industry, which any of us can go look and see who did what for whom. That's like kind of public domain. It's a game of telephone, and even if you acquire the model or the data you might be looking for, well, maybe there wasn't a report that explained why they did something, or the guy who did it is gone now, and so there's no one to call. And so a lot of what we're trying to build is to address these consistent issues, which once again, just enable people to find what they're looking for, trust that they can use it, not start from scratch again. And it starts with, we have to create the library, the shelves, the card catalog system to find the books organized on the shelves in some fashion. And that has two kind of components, which really are software development type components. The front end being like, okay, whether it's a technical user, like we just heard from David, there's different levels of users, like someone who's not a modeler might just want to go in and find a flood map that was spit out of a model. Someone who's a modeler might want to go in and see what rainfall data set was used for some reason. And so developing the web interface where these different user groups can kind of navigate to what they seek is the first piece of it. And then the second piece of it is the back end, which is all the coding and things that allow the interface to help you search, whether it's zooming into points on a map or typing in a keyword or looking through a folder or directory, and creating, the metadata behind it, which is basically the data that describes the data. It is something that is being developed by the program. And it's also like, this is not just a LWI problem or a DOTD problem. CPRA and all their models has this same issue and are like co-developing this kind of statewide standard. Also, we're now getting calls from FEMA and the Army Corps saying like, hey, we may want in on this because we have the same problems. And so in that back end, there's the metadata, the catalog describes how you find things, where it lives. There's a cost, right, to store terabytes of data somewhere. And then there's another cost to access it, right? Like the kind of how they get you in the doors. It's cheap to put your data somewhere, but then each time you want to download it, it's another charge. And that's where costs can skyrocket from retail storage or even non-retail locations. And then, like I said, how we organize this all consistently across every region. Because even if we said to each region's lead consultant, okay, we want you to organize your data, well, there would be 9 different ideas of the best way to organize data. And so we're trying to make some consistency across the board. I'm not going to go too much into this slide just for time constraints, but basically it's just a schematic of how people would, or how the flow of data, right? Like you have modelers creating things, but users who may not be modelers or might be, want to find data in the future. And so I'm going to kind of, we can come back to this if people have questions later, but for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of get to the meat of the matters. And so how does that look, right? In the state, there are various levels of ability and capability to use these models or manage them in the future, right? There's going to be differing needs. You'll have regions like Region 5 that is very willing and able to partake in the management and maintenance of models, but then the reality is there's other regions that are not. And so how do we create a consistent statewide standard while also enabling those who are willing and able to take things to the next level and to really be proactive in how they manage their watersheds. And that problem kind of is twofold, right? There's the data and model issue, but then there's kind of the more mundane IT side of things, like where are we storing this stuff in? Who gets called when someone's password doesn't work or there's a broken website link? And each of those things has like real costs behind it, whether it's a human cost of IT management or a storage cost or whatever it might be. And so the way that the state is planning to tackle this is, like I said, to create like a consistent software, if you will, that could then be partitioned really if there are different regions who want greater ownership or management of data and want to take things beyond what the LWI said. But in any case, future researchers or future engineers who are used to working in one region and need to go gain access to the neighboring regions information would be looking at something that was laid out extremely similar from region to region. It would just be a collaboration between the state and the different regions on a case-by-case basis of who's doing what. And so what we're calling this approach is the federated approach. And you know, we considered like I said, you know, what if every region was just on an island and had to do it themselves? What if the state said, no, we're going to do it all ourselves in a centralized way? And the federated approach is kind of a mix of both, right? Like I said, because there's just some regions that are not, they don't have population centers. They might not have huge bases of knowledge, and whether it's in academia or consulting engineering, who are kind of around to partake in these activities. But there are others that are and actively want to, you know, want a very leadership role in those things. And so the thought is, you take what's on the left side, the blue side of the screen, and that's where there's that real kind of discussion and negotiation and high level of coordination between the state and the regions on who's leading what, right? The state is fully aware that they don't necessarily have the best pulse on like how what the latest bridges and culverts have been constructed in some region when it comes time for an update, and that the regions probably have a better grasp on that. Likewise, though, if you're trying to run 9 versions of a software that is intended to do the same thing with 9 different IT departments doing it, right? Like you can really, costs can spiral quickly. And so the thought is like, well, the state can handle that kind of baseline background activity on the right side of the screen. And then just free up the regions to truly focus on the important pieces of the governance around updates and latest data, and who's kind of managing the models. So where does this stand? This software is being constructed right now. There's been a lot of consultation with the modeling consultants who are building the models, as well as folks from all the state agencies participating within the LWI, as well as folks from some of the federal agencies I mentioned as well, who have kind of like-minded user groups. There is due for, in software world, they use the term minimum viable product, which is like the most basic thing that does what you want it to do. And so that's scheduled to be delivered by 2023, but then there's inevitably the step of like people start trying to use it and find, I wanted to do this thing and I can't, that functionality is not there, or that functionality is there, but it doesn't, it's broken. It doesn't do it how we hoped it would. So 2024 will be, you know, like the break it testing or the beta testing where you're working out all the kinks. And then as this timeline is intended to line up with the delivery from all the regional consultants of some of their later batches of models, so that as those things are delivered, the system is operationalized and ready to go. I'll pause for any questions about that before we jump to some transition zone discussion. Yes.
who's having, is there a task force that's like collaboration between the federal level government, state and regional and stuff from the government structure?
So we, 2 weeks ago, Billy, 3 weeks ago, all of the state agencies and kind of program management level consultants involved with the LWI had a 2-day, for lack of a better term, retreat in person, where basically since the model use, storage and maintenance conversation has been ongoing, there was a recognized need very early on that there needed to be like a statewide standards steering committee who would be setting these kind of ground rules or minimum baseline regulations on what does, you should at least update your model every 5 years, but if you're an achiever, you can do it in every year or 2 years, or, those kind of things. And so that group, like who should populate that group, was an action item that came out this meeting 2 months ago. There's not like a list of names, but I think the program is very open to suggestions on like the types of personas that should populate that group. Whether it's, obviously representatives from academia or the agencies or consulting. So that was a near-term action item for the LWI to stand up, as like, we're close enough now where, yes, we're talking about delivery end of 2024, but it's going to take time to recruit those people and stand up a functioning group to then start making those decisions. So that's a long way to say it's ongoing or about to happen.
The only thing I would add, Brett, to which I think the LWI program has all areas, all regions globally moved to an integrated water resources management. The LWI program has focused this issue on all things water consistency, not just for like you said, for LWI program, but CPRA, DNR, DEQ, just the whole. It's really raising a whole, and I'm grateful that you guys are helping lead that effort.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Say the minimum viable model usable for people.
Well, I'll make a distinction or clarification there. When I'm talking about minimum viable product, I'm just talking about the background, like library catalog system for how you find what model or piece of data that went into a model. So we would not anticipate it being there, but also I don't think that's necessarily an integral component yet to like the round 3 analysis. I admittedly though, I'm not in the weeds of the round 3 process either. So that might be more of a Billy question.
I don't know if the microphone picks me up, but what I would say is that this is a question of scale. As we've harped on the scale of these models, we are building watershed scale models. So if you fund local scale projects, these won't be the best models for evaluation. If we have the funding to do true watershed scale projects, these are absolutely the right models for evaluating. So it really comes down to what is the scale of projects that are coming through Route 3.
And to close the thoughts on the model use, storage and maintenance, you heard Eric talk about with some of these technologies now, LWI is not just building models, it's collecting in a massive amount of survey data that are going to have plenty of uses to city administrators, parish engineering departments, et cetera, that, to create a system to be able to find just that data alone is a way to protect the state's investment on not, every time someone wants to go do something that would need to know about a particular bridge or culvert, to not have to go pay to survey it again, to be able to go look and find the surveys that were done through this program. So there's the intended benefits are beyond inputs to models. The next topic is a little bit kind of more broader or coastwide update on transition zone flooding. And as Garland had said, like this is kind of like the state of the science right now. A lot of groups, a lot of coastal areas are, the technology is there now where we can tackle this problem. And then to put it into really simple terms, all of us in coastal Louisiana are familiar with different versions of flood maps or FEMA maps, CPRA master plan maps. And really simply, those things are often either considering wind and storm surge only, or fluvial and pluvial, so rainfall and riverine considerations only. But we know, and you can see in this, we tried to make a cartoon of it. If you move from right to left, right, when you have rainfall and riverine considerations, I don't know if people can see the cursor here, but this lower or this light blue line, right, as you move from inland to the coast, that flood area and flood depth, the water has area to spread out. So your depths get less and less as even if it rains more and more once you're over the bays or over the Gulf. And again, conversely, as surge moves inland, right, it penetrates less and less due to the density of vegetation. But there's this shaded area in the middle where we know theoretically rain and surge have and wind and riverine flows all have these interactions that aren't necessarily just additive. You can't just take your analysis of rainfall only and your analysis of surge only, add them together, and there's your answer on flood depth. There's some pretty complex interactions going on. And so when you hear people talk about this compound flooding analysis, it's the analysis of these complex interactions and what are we missing out on in our flood depth predictions by not modeling it all together. And so this analysis is, we have these program objectives that are in kind of the guidance documentation of all the modeling, and the compound flood analysis is intended to support all these primary objectives of enabling the best risk communication as possible, to make best use of all these incredible models that are being built. And I'm actually gonna zoom out after this slide, or unhide a slide after this. But this is a problem, or this is a field that a lot of folks are trying to tackle right now. CPRA wants to, they've just released a master plan with the directions that things are going. It's a possibility that this kind of analysis could be included in the next. The Army Corps and FEMA have been at the table with us the whole time, reviewing what we're doing, because they also are trying to figure out a consistent method of how to do this. And so what the LWI doing is basically to date, we've been developing the methods. All right, what's the playbook? How do we all do this consistently? Not necessarily even just across Louisiana's coast, but in other places as well, and produce results that everyone can trust. And when I say results, I mean flood depth maps that are like probabilities of flood depth, like your 100-year flood depth or your 500-year flood depth, or whatever it may be. And so when you look at that in practice, this is some model results, and if you recall the cartoon I showed you, right, there's like this blue area in the middle. What we did was we ran thousands and 322,500 storms that kind of considered many different possibilities of tropical events or non-tropical events or big events or small events. Were you in a drought before this event happened, you were in a very wet period before it happened. What were riverine flows doing? Was it a high tide? Was it a low tide? And so you do all these analysis and you look at only surge or only rainfall in the riverine flow. And then we took the difference. And so, see if you can see my cursor here. I put some arrows. We did this in the Amy, but you can see like in Lake Maurepas, the difference is not very big, right? Less than a foot, meaning coastal influences are dominating. Rainfall is spreading out. It's not changing your answer on flooding. Similarly, if you go pretty far inland, the differences are very small again, meaning surge influences aren't really doing anything and it's completely rainfall and riverine dominated. But in the middle of these two arrows, like in the Tickfall River area, you get pretty significant differences, several feet, many feet, half a dozen feet on some cases. And what that's telling us is this is flood depth that is likely to occur that we're missing with the current analysis methods that are used. Like we're not capturing this. And so the point of the compound flooding analysis is to try and capture this flood risk that has not been captured to date. And so where we stand right now, back up. Where we stand right now with that is the methods have kind of been developed. We're wrapping that up right now. And the program is about to move into a period where we then go employ these methods across all 4 regions in the coast over the next year and a half, 2 years to produce more accurate flood mapping products. These are not construed to be like FEMA regulatory products or anything like that, but it will be a much more accurate depiction of flood risk along the coast. So same thing, I'll pause for a second before I move to the last topic of consequence modeling. Scooter.
Changes that's been measured, say with claims data and so forth along the coast. Would that also put into the account of the forecasted changes? Because the rapid changes that we experience from subsidence, accretion, modification, project implementation, all that changes a lot within a year.
Right.
So how do you?
So I'll say that to be clear right now, the LWI is not modeling like future conditions. That's not to say all these tools that are being developed couldn't be used for that. It's just that like Rome wasn't built in a day either. And we're right now we're looking at current conditions. However, there's nothing to say you couldn't take like a CPRI master plan projected digital elevation model and replace it in the future. And well, I'm using, you can pick your data input of what you think the coast will look like in the future. But you know, like Eric said, you can go in and swap out different model inputs as they become available in the future, whether it's LiDAR or vegetation coverage or precipitation data sets, and analyze those things with this framework. All right, how am I doing on time? All right, I'll go really quick on this one. Last but not least, consequence modeling. All right, so LWI, we're going to make models. Those models are going to output predictions of what's flooding, where, how deep, how fast, right? But then there's that last step of consequences. So that's, when we say consequences, we mean the financial consequences of flooding, right? What does it cost in dollars to damages and structures as a result of this flooding that's being predicted in the models? And so there's plenty of well-established methods that allow you to relate a flood depth to a damage in all kind of different types of structures. And these images on screen are actually pretty old Army Corps images, but they're a nice, simple way of showing how, as things get deeper to a point, your damage to a structure increases, and then at some point it kind of levels off because the structure's very, very damaged, and more flooding doesn't necessarily do more after a point. And so what the LWI is intending to do in this space is, like Billy said, there's some national data sets right now that try and capture all the structures. To do consequence modeling, you need two things: where are the structures and what are their attributes, like their square footage or their first floor elevation, and then how deep is the flooding at those structures. And there is no one perfect data set for where the structures are and what do they look like question. There's a bunch of data sets that have like pieces of answers. And so the most common one is the National Structure Inventory that the Army Corps creates and maintains, but there's other data sets as well. And what the LWI is doing is putting together all of these things to try and paint a much broader picture of where the structures are, what type are they. And then there's still going to be holes. Even after that, you still have like a 20% no coverage, or you might know there's a structure there and that's it. You don't know anything about it in terms of its size or its first floor elevation. And so on top of putting together all the existing data sets, the LWI is kind of like imputing data based on some machine learning techniques. And what you see on the right is actually our partners at the University of Purdue trained a machine learning algorithm to go through Google Street View data, recognize the type of structure, its first floor elevation, and some other attributes about it that allow you to get at that data you're missing if you don't have, say, elevation certificates. And so what is going to result is a statewide structure inventory that's much more robust than anything we've had in the past. It also will be subject, I'm sure, to many revisions as better data becomes available. Yeah.
Just one question on your last item in the data, 0.19 meter high foundation. That is the measured height over adjacent ground elevation?
Correct. And then the other piece that's under development is like a viewer that says, okay, we've run these models for flood depth, we've run these calculations about damages. Decision makers and planners, though, need some way to digest all of this. And so what's being put together, and this will be likely at a regional scale, is just a web viewer that allows you to then filter through to different aspects you might want, whether you're chasing pre or post disaster funding, or you're looking at what your risk profile is given your geographic area or your jurisdiction. And so the thought is not to just say, okay, here's a bunch of data, go figure out what it means. It's to help create a tool that will help with some of the digestion of what that financial risk from flood consequences is. And I know we're a couple minutes over time, so I'm gonna wrap it, but I'll say that structure inventory, we're in kind of the last stages right now within the next month of being able to release like the first draft to the consulting team who's gonna help run all the consequence modeling. The viewer is being developed over the remainder of 2023. And so those things, once again, are intended to be kind of online when all the models are delivered to the state over the course of 2024. And so that is kind of some broader updates we had for everyone.
And the only thing I want to add, hopefully it's obvious at the end of this 2 hours, everything is geospatial, right? So you don't have GIS teams or whatever, just know that all the data is coming in, it's all being managed geospatially.
I have one question for you and one for Lauren too.
the consequence modeling, and maybe I've had my head in the same one I thought, but this is the first I've heard of it. Is this something that's been thought from the very start, or did it kind of morph somewhere along the way?
So it's something that's been done in bits and pieces across the state, like it's done when there's federal feasibility study, like Southwest Coastal or things like that. It's been done for coastal master plans, but only in the coastal zone. And so the intent of the LWI program is to take it statewide, and also to give it as best of an input data set as you can with the structure inventory piece. But the methods being used to create the structure inventory for the rest of the state are extremely similar to what CPRA does for the master plan. It's just being extended geographically to everywhere else.
Really big deal, man. It's really cool. Garland, I want to ask you, you had shown us, I think, a year ago about the wind impacts, which blew my mind because it's something I just didn't think about, right? How big are the wind impacts when you get further north? Say Alexandria, for instance, all like it says.
Not much.
No, okay.
So you can have impacts inland on large bodies of water. So if you think about it with wind blowing over a tree cover, any of that, so the smaller stream, you have more tree cover that's adapted. In addition to it, whenever you have a meandering channel, so it's pushing with it and against it in certain areas, so it's kind of, it gets over at the watershed scale, and the impact isn't that much unless you have like a big, just just wide open body of water where it can really start to stack up and have an effect on a large surface of water.
Yeah, on the consequence, the HEC products, meat included
Yeah, I'll clarify. So for consequence modeling, what LWI is starting with, there's a number of different lengths you can take it to, even as far as the simulation of loss of life potential. For now, LWI is just focusing on the economic impact to structures. But it is using, or it's based on you've seen HEC RAS or HEC HMS. The Army Corps also releases consequence modeling products called HEC FIA and HEC LifeSim. And FIA is what the LWI is going to base its analysis off of. Once again, it's kind of ubiquitous in the consulting community. It's open, it's free to use. And so that was a consideration as well of, picking tools that are familiar and accessible to people who might be using them down the road.
And after great research, I mean, y'all run all the kind of stuff.
We looked at a bunch, and picked these. So yeah, there was a good deal of thought behind that.
And there was also some discussion, you mentioned tech FIA. I don't think you mentioned the consequences side of it, which is a more large scale, so it allows them to run it basically using computer scripting to run large swaths of it. And that'll be good whenever we get more and more of this data out to kind of get, large swaths of run in it. But the idea for not using that as the sole one is because the community, the engineering community, is familiar with FIA, and it's more.
It's a GUI based most people are familiar with graphical user interfaces on programs, and I can click a button and load in my file or whatever. And so what the Army Corps has is kind of a dual, it's the same math behind it. And we went through some great lengths to prove the math was the same if you give it the same inputs. But they also have, like Billy said, a script-based version where people can use command line prompts to, instead of in the GUI running just a few events, which might be more familiar to people at a smaller scale. Like with the compound flooding, we're looking at thousands and thousands of events. And you could very easily use these scripts to perform compound flooding analysis on all of it in minutes, and then really dig into the financial risk that you might be facing in an area. So the tools are out there now to to do these things at scale, if people have that ability.
I think one of the big, I think the kind of a way to put it into kind of layman's terms on FIA versus Go Consequences is Go Consequences is a much more robust version of it, but heck FIA is a more portable version of it. They can kind of be delivered with the models where you can kind of have it all on your computer and do it in one spot.
So yeah. Go ahead. I was gonna say the program is gonna deliver both, right? So it's there, these tools are set up and there for whichever level of user they may encounter in the future.
So everything I heard today, you know, it's all flooded, rain gas, and some storm surge situation. But if we look at existing infrastructure failing. And I'll use the Mermentau Basin as an example. With the rice, the farm, cattle, crawfish, and this is massive industry. One failure. Salinity content that is now a factor of habitat changes, inundation. Is that also in the mix? Which is a whole monster on itself.
Well, I mean, what Eric and I were, as we were prepping for this presentation, that I think hopefully that the one message that I definitely would hope that you take away, because I really think the thinking has to begin now. We've got the Water Institute, we've got UL, we've got other academic LSU, we've got TDQ team, which now all of a sudden is, like you said, the interest in the federal, at first the federal agency was like, yeah, now they're sensing the scale of this. And I'm not surprised that FEMA is coming like, what are y'all doing about this? Because this, all of a sudden Louisiana's on that cutting edge. Texas is like, what are y'all doing? Or we can do it better and bigger. But the one thing that Eric and I were talking about, a lot of the regions and the pace, depending on how integrated the regions are working together and how they work collaboratively, there's so many directions these model bases will go in terms of an integrated approach. I mean, right now, obviously, you know, there's a strong with CPARA being really one of the first coastal teams to develop master plans, and other people looking at, well, what did CPRA do for coastal planning in other states? Now you're getting this integrated riverine, pluvial, coastal modeling. Groundwater, right, is going to have to eventually, these models are going to end up being integrated into one water. There's no doubt in my mind. And I think I'll be honest with you, as you know, the saying goes, iron sharpens iron. The regions are it's going to be interesting to us that work in this industry to see which regions really push the modeling to be more, how would I say, comprehensive, holistic, you know, adding the features that are feasible to add, and because models inform models, right? And particularly with everything being geospatial, it's going to be fascinating to see what happens in that regard.
No, this is truly impressive. Like Eric's presentation. He didn't make the cut. Well, I want to see the guy that made the cut. I mean, this is incredible.
Well, you see the Mermentau, you talk about the Mermentau model, and the one thing that has just jumped out at me with Mermentau is the fact, well, obviously we're dealing with man's intervention with the Chaffalai system, right? That's obvious. But like Mermentau, that you had this big coastal prairie, and then we built I-10 and 90 across it. The constrictions you see in that space and the bathymetry that we acquired, to where it comes out of the Mermentau headwaters, but to get through those gaps, the river is minus 95 minus 90 feet deep. Scouring underneath the interstates. And then it comes back up and it's going out into the Gulf at what, minus 10, minus 15?
I thought we had a survey bust.
And you go, well, that is a bathtub because it's going down to get under the
We
interstate.
had this talk yesterday about Texas buying that water. So when you look at the isolating lines that have adjusted now. So what's gonna happen when that volume of water disappears? And it starts going, I mean, this is massive. change.
Informed decision. I mean, obviously, the talent that Brett and Hugh and the others at TWI represent, UL, it's like I said, I'm excited because in the 40-something years I've been practicing, a lot of what we've had to make decisions has been just based on anecdotal information and not. These models provide tools that you can really drill down and say, well, if you do that, here's what's gonna happen.
Yeah, and what I'd add as far as like whenever you start talking about saltwater, I won't say saltwater intrusion, but the saltwater slug that's wanting to creep up underneath your flows. Your concern is coming to low flows. How much, flow do we have to basically counteract that slug? Now, one of the limitations, and we recognize it early on when we're developing how far we will model, is that, there's a big push for low flow modeling. We're going, guys, this is like, we understand the value of it, but that is a matter of cost. And to get stable, low flows on models, it takes a lot more bathymetry and a lot more survey than we can afford in this process. And so whenever it was looking at, what are some give and take? We have 100 million to spend here. What do we have to cut? And it came down to the conversation in the room was this funding came about because of a flood. And so let's focus on the causes of flooding. Now, what this does is you can go in, use these models and refine them down further, add in that additional bathymetry and start making some of those refinements. And then you can start doing those low flows more accurately. But this sets up the skeleton that all this meat is going to attach to as we build in this perfect being of modeling that we're hoping for. And so I think that's something to keep in mind.
Eric had a slide earlier that was a very subtle piece of evidence of that conversation where you were listing, Eric, like some of the selections on loss methods and things in the software. And it said like that was in constant method or this, that, which are, from engineering textbooks and generally lost in the crowd, but those selections were made intentionally because some of those things better support like a future low flow analysis than others. So if there is a decision that could be made now that allows someone to come back later and add more refinement and look at that, the table was intentionally set as much as it could be given the time and budget to allow for those things later to be cognizant of them. And that was Dr. Robert Miller at UL who kind of just brings some of the thinking behind, all the clicks you have to make to set up a HEC-RAS or HEC-MS model, other unintended or intentional things you can do to set that up for later.
And Garland mentioned earlier the acceleration of the improvements to the software. And one of the big improvements that they made in Tech 6 was that they have resolved a lot of these stability issues when wetting and unwetting. And that gets down to the low flow question, is because it used to be on some of the old models, if that thing dried and the cell went dry, it would just crash the system. It's like, whoa, we have cell go dry over here. And it would crash the system. Well, whenever you try and get low flows, it's important for those cells to be able to kind of, and HEC-RAS 6, whenever they brought it, I can't speak to the details of how, but they were able to allow that wetting and drying in the cycle that it can stay stable now. So when we were developing all this, that was not an option. We were like, no, we can't let these dry because we're going to lose stability. The models are going to basically break on us. And so as we move forward, I think as the updates come, I think it's something, as I said, it's a lot that we have that we can build upon from here, and we're getting us a lot of way towards the finish line.
We're definitely breaking their models. We're in quite constant conversation with them and seeing this issue, and I have to say, HEC is actually now, sure they're feeding back to you guys too, because I know you are in constant conversation. They're excited by this because this is really driving their product beyond what they even imagined, I think, even 2 years ago. So it's been a good thing all the way around. You get into it, you start to look at some things and you go, wow. Without that model, you can't see them. You can't see it, but it's there. And I mean, kudos to Billy, to DOTD and others to, but please continue the discussion, because I think, like David Cody says, that the state's looking for that feedback. The one thing you don't want to see happen is this kind of expense and detail be developed and it just go on the shelf. I mean, don't want that to happen.
Yeah, and so my comment, the whole presentation was very impressive, and I know that you'll have to build this, and this is kind of the framework. So from local government perspective, I certainly hope that the state and the federal government continues funding this project where we can drill down and then be able to use it for those flood events where they're asking us to verify all the losses that we have in an area to be able to receive FEMA funding or whatever insurance funding that we have to. So we understand this had to be built, but we hope it continues and grows and totally matures.
Or work against us, with everything he just said. It may be a point, could this thing be developed? And now you can no longer build it. Or that kind of thing, you know, so.
Well, that's,
It-
I mean,
it's-
it'll
yeah.
make it a whole lot harder to justify those variances.
Yeah.
So, hey, and I mean, from my perspective, we should not be building in a lot of areas that we can build in, or smarter building, put it up
Yeah, yeah.
piers like our grandparents did.
You not be the bad guy, model to be the bad.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we live in a parish where 85% of the parish is in a flood zone. Have a little bit effective on that.
But that gives you more justification for this protection and restoration.
It's not simply saying no, it's trying to show, and the people.
Market, spend other areas to protect them. So they can lower their costs, because they have certified levies and those type of things like that.
Well, the one thing I'd say, kudos to you guys in Region 5. It's obvious. It's amazing to me to see, like on the steering committee, the knowledge base that steering committee represents. And I'm talking about not only politically, but also technically. The Region 5 group, you know, there's going to be this, when these models are finished and the LWI program is funding different things. My personal hope and prayer is that the Region 5 group, because nobody can, what impacts you is different than people in North Louisiana, right? But I hope you stay engaged, because there's obviously a lot of core studies and that sort of thing that are coming in behind. There's other people modeling the same space, but there's going to be these decision points. And if there is, I think it was the focus of key in my presentation, LFMA, if there's a region that represents the potential for to truly move towards that integrated, maintaining autonomy and, you know, your corner and your corner and your corner, but to integrate decision-making and use that collective knowledge to make the right decisions and to ask the right questions. To me, Region 5 represents. I'm glad we're sort of like the first one to do this presentation. Point of personal pride. Because I think that's what y'all hope to see come out of this.
Any other questions? Online, we're a little bit over. So hang it in there. Well, I want to thank you, Billy, thank you DOT, LWI has so many consultants, thank you HCR Engineering, the Water Institute, Henry Consulting, all our steering committee members. You know, the phrase that takes a village, I think it takes a multitude of villages that we're doing. And we have a lot of passionate people, and which I appreciate in Region 5 and throughout the state. So thank you all very much for coming today in person and those attending online. We plan to have this reporting soon on our website. Now I'll send out an email when that's available. Thank you very much.